In this video, I'm going to review acid and base balance. The first thing you need to do is you need to go back to the information from the first test and review pH. So acid, base, the relative concentrations of hydrogen to hydroxyl ions, you need to go and review that information because you will see a few questions on that on the exam over this material. Now, why is pH so important? We have all these proteins in the body. We've talked about enzymes and digestive system. We've talked about neurotransmitters. We've talked about hemoglobin. All of these are proteins, and they have very unique shapes. And if you change the shape of those proteins, then you're going to change its function. So what happens is if there's too many or too little hydrogen ions, or too little or too many hydroxyl ions, what happens is it will start to change the shape of the protein. So let's say excess hydrogen ions come in. It modifies the shape of the amino acids that make up the protein, which then changes the shape of the protein, and it doesn't work. So the reason we're going through this is because maintaining proper pH is critical to maintaining protein function, which obviously is going to keep you alive. Optimal pHs, arterial blood, venous blood. What I'm looking for, intracellular fluid, what I'm going to be looking for is that you know that the normal range of pH is between 7.35 and 7.45. Yes, there are other places in your body where it's different. For example, the stomach, we talked about a pH of 2. But in your bloodstream, it needs to be maintained between 7.35 and 7.45. If the pH gets above 7.45, then you're said to be in alkalosis or alkalemia. I'll usually use the term alkalosis. If your pH of arterial fluid drops below 7.35, you're said to be in acidosis or acidemia, and again I will use the term acidosis. So if you think about it from a homeostasis standpoint, 7.4 is your set point, 7.35 is your low end, 7.45 is your high end. Your body stays in that range. If it gets above or below that range, then you are in disease, acidosis, or alkalosis. So just to show you what can cause acidosis, you can accumulate acids, hydrogens, or you can lose bases, hydroxyl ions. So whatever happens, if the balance between those two is thrown off, then what happens is your pH drops and you can go into acidosis. If you lose acids or accumulate bases, so you lose hydrogen ions or you gain hydroxyl ions, you get a decrease in hydrogen ions, relatively speaking, and your pH goes up and you go into alkalosis. Now, just to show you how important pH is, there's 3 different methods that can help maintain the proper pH range of 7.35 to 7.45. There's chemical buffer systems. These are the first line of defense against pH changes. They work very quickly, but they only have a small capacity to maintain pH. So one of the questions, several questions on the test are going to involve which of these systems works the fastest, which works the slowest, which has the highest capacity, and which has the smallest capacity. So buffer systems work quickly, but their capacity to maintain proper pH is low. The respiratory system is the second system. The respiratory system has a higher capacity than buffers, but it works a little bit slower. So what happens is you have a higher capacity, but it works slower. So it takes 1 to 3 minutes for your respiratory system to start influencing or maintaining proper pH. By breathing more and breathing at a higher frequency, what happens is you can maintain proper homeostasis. So one of the reasons your breathing increases when you're exercising is because you're trying to maintain proper pH. So it works slower than buffers. It has a higher capacity for changing pH. The kidneys have the highest capacity to maintain proper pH, but they also work the slowest. So an example is if for some reason you're choking, if you're choking on something and you can't breathe, what happens is your respiratory system is not working properly and your pH is going to change. But if you keep choking, your kidneys are not going to be able to work quickly enough to compensate for what the lungs are not doing. So they work slower, but they have a very high capacity in order to maintain proper pH. So buffers work the fastest, respiratory system the next fastest, kidneys the slowest. You need to know the order of the speed. You also need to know by capacity. Buffers have the slowest capacity, kidneys have the highest capacity to maintain proper pH, and the respiratory system is in the middle. Now I'm going to go through how each of these systems maintains a constant pH within the normal range. Buffers. There are several different buffer systems in the body. I don't want you to have to memorize all of them, but I want you to understand how buffers work. So you have these molecules that can either bind to hydrogen ions or they can release hydrogen ions in order to maintain proper pH or resist major changes in pH. So when a hydrogen ion is bound to something, when it's bonded to something, it doesn't influence your pH. It's when it's an ion by itself, a hydrogen ion floating around, that it does influence your pH. You have three major buffer systems. Again, I'm not concerned that you're familiar with each of them. I just want you to know the basics of how buffers work. So here's a buffer, and here's a buffer. Here are free-floating hydrogen ions. These free-floating hydrogen ions are changing the pH. They are making the pH go down because we're increasing hydrogen ions. In this case, what the buffer will do, it will bind to the hydrogen ions, thus maintaining the proper pH. But what I want you to notice is this buffer can only carry so many hydrogen ions. It can only carry 3. So if there is a 4th and a 5th and a 100th, the buffer can't bind. So it's limited in how many hydrogen ions it can bind to. That's where the low capacity comes in. It can only maintain proper pH to a certain extent because it runs out of places for the hydrogens to bind. Now what happens when your pH goes up? Again, in a normal range, then what the buffer can do, it can release the hydrogen ions and help maintain the proper pH. So again, buffers either bind to hydrogen ions or they release hydrogen ions, but they are limited. Notice this buffer has no more hydrogen ions that it can release. It can't release any more. It can't have any more influence on the pH. The respiratory system regulates pH. It has a higher capacity to maintain or help buffer, but it works slower than buffers do. Remember this equation. Right, now what I can't put on the PowerPoint is to show you that this equation goes both directions. It can run this way or it can run this way, depending on the concentration of the different molecules. So if CO2 level goes up, the equation runs this way. Hydrogen ions go up, it runs the equation this way. Okay, so what happens? What happens when somebody goes for a run, let's say? When someone goes for a run, their CO2 levels are going to go up because they're using oxygen, and so are their hydrogen ions. So what happens is, when you raise the hydrogen ions, it's going to move the equation this way. Remember we discussed this, or you discussed it, when you talked about the respiratory system. So when hydrogen ions go up, it drives the equation this way, increases CO2. Remember what stimulates breathing. What stimulates breathing, has the biggest influence on breathing, is CO2 levels is first, hydrogen ion levels are second. So when these two go up, it stimulates breathing and drives the equation this way. You're blowing out the CO2. By blowing out the CO2, you are maintaining the hydrogen ion concentration. So again, when the equation goes this way and you breathe out the CO2, because of this equation, you're indirectly getting rid of hydrogen ions and you're maintaining the proper pH. So that's normally how it works. The equation may run this way, it may run this way. There's not dramatic changes in CO2 levels and hydrogen ion concentration. So the equation is able to maintain the proper pH. But what happens? What happens if something throws this equation off? For example, let's say somebody is choking on something. When they're choking on something and they can't breathe out, their CO2 levels are going to go sky high. Their CO2 levels are going to rise dramatically. And when that happens, it's going to drive the equation this way. So really high CO2 levels, it drives the equation in this direction, which does what to hydrogen ion concentration? It's going to raise it. What's that going to do to pH? If you increase hydrogen ion concentration, you're going to decrease the pH, and someone can go into what's called respiratory acidosis. So as long as this equation is balanced and things are going back and forth and you're maintaining the proper balance of CO2 and hydrogen ions, you're okay. But if for some reason, decrease in breathing rate, your CO2 levels go up because you're not getting rid of them, drives the equation this way, and your pH goes down, and you can go into respiratory acidosis. So if the reason you're going into acidosis is due to a respiratory problem, we call it respiratory acidosis. Now, you can also go into respiratory alkalosis, which is not as common, okay, An example is, let's say you're hyperventilating. You're blowing out CO2, okay? You're blowing out CO2. Your CO2 levels will go down. When your CO2 levels go down, this one drops, the equation runs this way, and your hydrogen ion concentration is going to go down. So if your CO2 level goes down, the equation goes this way, your hydrogen ion levels go down, and you can go into respiratory alkalosis. Respiratory acidosis is much more common than alkalosis. So, how do you go into respiratory acidosis? You decrease your rate and depth of breathing, you obstruct the air passage, or you decrease gas exchange. This example would be for someone who, let's say, had emphysema, and they've lost surface area in their alveoli, so CO2 does not diffuse from the bloodstream into the lungs as well. CO2 builds up, drives the equation, then you get more hydrogen ions, you go into respiratory acidosis. Now, if this happens, then the accumulation of CO2 is going to happen very quickly, and you'll go into respiratory acidosis. If you have a disease like emphysema or pulmonary fibrosis, where the gas exchange, the alveoli are slowly disappearing or being destroyed or not functioning, the accumulation of CO2 is going to occur slowly, which means you probably won't go into respiratory acidosis right away, because since it's happening slowly, your kidneys will be able to compensate for it. And I'll talk about that in a minute. Now, how do you go into respiratory alkalosis? Anxiety, fever, poisoning, high altitude where you're going to be hyperventilating, causes a loss of CO2, decreases the concentration of hydrogen ions, and can lead to respiratory alkalosis. Go back to the equation if you need to understand this, that if this goes down, then this goes down too, because the equation is going to run to the left. Last, what can the kidneys do to control pH? They can actually give chemical buffers. The lungs can only get rid of CO2, but the lungs can't make new buffer. The kidneys can actually get rid of metabolic acids like uric acid and phosphoric acid and ketones. Ketones can form when someone has diabetes that's out of control. So your kidneys can literally get rid of the acids that can cause the problems in pH. And the kidneys also have the ability to produce or increase or decrease the amount of buffers in the body. Kidneys have a very high capacity to work, but they work slowly. Sorry, that's hard to read, but they work slowly. Again, if you stop breathing quickly, your kidneys are not going to be able to keep up with it. Okay, so let's see what happens. We're back to our little nephron here. Let's say you get an accumulation of hydrogen ions in the bloodstream. So your hydrogen ions is going up, your pH is going down. What do you think logically is going to happen, or what can the kidneys do to maintain proper pH? What they can do is they can secrete hydrogen ions. So what they've done is secreted from the blood into the filtrate. They have secreted hydrogen ions. There's going to be a give and take here. For every hydrogen that is secreted, there's going to be one bicarbonate that's going to be reabsorbed. Now, how does this help us when our pH starts to go down? It helps us get rid of hydrogen ions, and it actually brings more buffer into the bloodstream, which can bind to more of the excess hydrogen ions. So again, we secreted hydrogen ions and we reabsorbed bicarbonate, or we reabsorbed a buffer to help us control pH. So if a person is in acidosis, what do you think the kidneys will do? I actually just gave you the answer to that. We can eliminate two of these because you don't secrete both and you don't reabsorb both. So what you have to think about is, what do we want to get rid of and what do we want to keep in the case of acidosis? It's either 1 or 4. What we want to do is we want to secrete hydrogen ions from the blood into the filtrate to get rid of it, and then we want to reabsorb bicarbonate, which will act as a buffer to help us neutralize other hydrogen ions in the bloodstream. So here is just what it is in words. The kidney can also make new bicarbonate. So here you have this is the cells within the kidney. They can actually make more bicarbonate. If you make more bicarbonate, then you've got more buffers that can help you in that situation. What if you're in alkalosis? What if you're in alkalosis? First of all, which two can we get rid of? We can get rid of this one and this one because they say the same thing. We knew in acidosis you did this. If you're in alkalosis, what do you want to do? You want to reabsorb hydrogen ions and you want to secrete buffer. We don't need more buffer if our hydrogen ion concentration is low. So we want to get rid of this and we want to bring this back into the bloodstream in order to maintain proper pH. Now, what happens if things go wrong? You can go into metabolic acidosis or metabolic alkalosis. Metabolic acidosis, you know it's metabolic if it's not about the lungs. If it's not about the lungs, then it's metabolic. Metabolic acidosis is more common than alkalosis. Severe diarrhea. If you lose bicarbonate, no, that's a mistake, not in the urine, but if you lose a lot of water, and you have diarrhea, what happens is your hydrogen ion concentration, your bicarbonate's your buffer. You get rid of your buffer, then you're going to have a higher rate of hydrogen ions. It increases in the blood. Probably the most common cause of metabolic acidosis is uncontrolled diabetes. What happens is when you can't use the sugar, you produce these things called ketones that actually come from unmetabolized fat. You get these ketones. The ketones is what gives the sweet smell to the breath of someone with diabetes, but it's also acidic, so it can actually lower your pH to a point that you are in acidosis. Metabolic alkalosis, a cause of it is vomiting, severe vomiting. If you lose a lot of hydrochloric acid, you're losing acid, which is going to make your blood more alkaline, and again, it can lead to metabolic alkalosis. So, what can lead into acidosis? You can lose a lot of bases due to the prolonged diarrhea. You can have kidney failure, so you can't excrete the acids. You can't secrete it, so you accumulate acids. You can have production of acidic ketones and diabetes, uncontrolled diabetes. All of these can lead to metabolic acidosis. Alkalosis, you can have vomiting, you can have gastric drainage, again from the stomach, losing hydrogen ions, and that can lead to metabolic alkalosis.